By now, you should have already finished the lesson on human male and female reproduction. We're just going to do a quick recap of some of the things that you should have learned during that lesson. Number one, these are called the ovaries. And so this is the location of the egg gamete in the female reproductive system. It's also the location of your growth and development hormone. So that would be estrogen and progesterone as well. And we'll talk about more about the job of those hormones when we get into our human anatomy unit. This is also the location of meiosis. And so everywhere in your body, mitosis is happening. Your skin cells are going through mitosis, hair cells, muscle cells, bone cells as you grow and develop, etc., etc. There's only one place in the female reproductive system where meiosis occurs, and it occurs in the ovaries. That is where one parent cell, the egg gamete, doubles its DNA, splits into two, then splits into four, and that's how you get your egg gametes in your reproductive system. If you did not have this in your notes from our lesson on the male and female reproductive system, make sure you pause the video and make sure you have this written down. Next, we'll recap the testes. And so the testes in the male reproductive system is the location of the sperm gamete. It's also where growth and development hormones are located as well. So your testosterone. This is also the location of meiosis. So again, there's only one place in both the male and female reproductive system where the process of meiosis takes place, because that is the creation of our reproductive cells, our gametes, our sex cells. In male reproductive system, this is happening in the testes. Again, if you did not write this down during our lesson on the male and female reproductive system, please make sure you pause the video and jot that down first. Next, let's recap the fallopian tubes. This is where fertilization has to take place. So you'll notice from the GIF that an egg is being released from the ovaries. The sperm cell would have to travel to the fallopian tubes in order for fertilization to take place. If fertilization does not occur in the fallopian tubes, pregnancy will not happen, sexual reproduction will not happen. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the human anatomy in our human anatomy unit later on this year. And then finally, the last thing I want to recap is the uterus. So a couple things about the uterus. Number one, this is the location where the zygote or the fertilized egg grows and develops into a baby, into a fetus. That does not happen in the stomach. So if you have nothing else written about the female reproductive system, this will be on the Regents. Please make sure that you know that in human reproduction, a zygote develops into a fetus or into a baby in the uterus. That is not the stomach. Also, the lining of the uterus sheds every 28 days if there is no zygote there developing and growing, and we call that process menstruation. Now, a lot of this is about the female reproductive system, and that's because today we're going to dive a bit into sexual reproduction and take a look at different forms of fertilization and development, which mostly occurs within the female reproductive system, but not always. We are going to learn about a couple of exceptions. And the reason why we are going over different forms of fertilization and development is because not all species produce sexually in the same way. So let's talk about that now. Make sure that you have a brand new notebook page set up for fertilization and development. You'll notice I have a bunch of images of different organisms on the screen. I have a dolphin, I have a baby, a cow, a frog, a goldfish, etc., etc. We are going to be learning about how, even though all of these organisms go through sexual reproduction, they don't necessarily all do it in the same way. So we'll be discussing as many of those differences as we can. So make sure you have the appropriate page set up in your notebook for your notes. So first thing that we're going to talk about is internal fertilization. So go ahead and write that label down in your notebooks, internal fertilization. So what is it? Now, a bunch of notes are going to pop up on the screen. I only want you to write down what is in red. Again, a lot of notes are going to pop up on the screen. I only want you to write what is in red. All right, here we go. Internal fertilization. So, internal fertilization is fertilization that occurs within the body of an organism. So, remember, fertilization is the joining of the two gametes, the sex cell and the sperm cell. Fertilization, the joining of those two cells, if it's internal fertilization, it has to occur within the body of an organism. So the sperm gamete and the egg gamete, they join together, they create a zygote. And a lot of land mammals and a lot of land organisms in general go through internal fertilization. Reptiles, birds, mammals like humans, they all reproduce by internal fertilization. The sperm and the egg gametes, they need to create that zygote inside of the organism's body. Go ahead and pause the video and jot this down, only the parts in red, and then press play when you're ready to move on. All right, let's move on to the next part. So, number one, where does fertilization happen in the human reproductive system? We talked about this when I introduced male and female reproductive systems to you, so see if you can think about it. Where in the female reproductive system does that fertilization, that joining of the sperm gamete and the egg gamete occur? Hopefully you remember that it is in the fallopian tube. So after the egg is released from the ovaries, it travels through the fallopian tube, and that takes several days. During that time, if sperm cells enter the female reproductive system and it happens to fertilize that female sex gamete, the egg, then the fertilization will actually happen in the fallopian tubes. If it does not happen in the fallopian tubes, then that pregnancy will not come to term. Jot that down in your notes if that's something that you did not know or if you did not write it in your notes when I introduced it the first time, and then press play when you're ready to move on. So that's a little bit about internal fertilization, what it is, and where it happens. Now let's talk about external fertilization. We discussed internal, let's go over external fertilization. External fertilization happens mostly in aquatic organisms, so fish, amphibians, etc. This is obviously opposite of internal fertilization. It is when fertilization takes place outside of the organism's body. So I have an example over there on the right for you. So with some fish, the female will lay her eggs at the bottom of an ocean floor, in coral reef, on a different parts of the ocean or lake or stream, wherever they live. Then a male fish will notice the eggs and he will fertilize them with the sperm gamete, and there's no interaction of the two parents. The female fish might be there at the same time as the male, or the female fish might have laid her eggs days ago, weeks ago. There is no interaction between the male species and the female species. External fertilization is when that sperm gamete and the egg gamete, they are joined to form a zygote, but it happens outside of the body, separate and apart from the two organisms involved. So this does typically happen with aquatic, so underwater organisms, because if the female gamete, the egg, is deposited somewhere, you don't want it to dry out. You don't want it to not be viable by the time the male lays his gamete there, the sperm cells. And so typically this does happen in places that are wet, like oceans and seas and other aquatic areas, because it keeps the egg cell, the egg gamete, viable while it's waiting for the sperm cell to be deposited. Go ahead and pause the video. Only write down what you see that is in red, and then press play when you are ready to move on. So that's external fertilization. We've learned about internal fertilization. That was one that you probably already knew about. Fertilization that has to happen within an organism's body. And now you've been aware of external fertilization. You probably knew that things like this happened. However, I wanted to give you the exact terminology and the definition for this process and how it takes place in our natural environment. Now, here are your last two notes. They are not in red, but I want you to write both of them down anyway. So we talked about fertilization. Now let's talk about development. These one-cell zygotes, when the zygote goes through mitosis, turns to 2 cells, then 4, then 8, then 16, then 32, then 64, and it becomes ears and legs and heart and muscle and veins and arteries and nerve endings. All of that is called development. The zygote, that one cell, is growing into a full organism. So, internal development is when the zygote grows inside of the organism's body, like a human. Fertilization happens in the body, and the baby grows inside of the organism's body as well. That is internal development. External development is obviously the opposite. It is when the zygote grows outside of the body. So, fertilization can happen either inside or outside, but development happens outside of the body. Think about a chicken who lays an egg. That's external development. Think about snakes when they lay their eggs. That's external development. I have a picture here of seahorses. Seahorses go through internal fertilization. So the male and the female, the gametes are fertilized inside of the organism's body, but then the female actually lays her eggs. The male seahorse puts them inside of his pouch, so he kind of like keeps them warm in his pouch while they are waiting to hatch. They don't go inside of his body. The male seahorse actually has a separate pouch where this happens. So that's still technically external development because the male is growing the offspring. So while they're growing, he's helping them to develop, but it is happening in a pouch outside of the male seahorse's body. So when you think of external development, think about seahorses, think about snakes, think about chickens and hens. Whether or not the fertilization happens internal, the growing or the development of the offspring is happening outside of the body. Pause the video, finish jotting down these two notes, and then press play when you're ready to move on. All right, let's move on to the last part. So look at the pictures you see. I see a dolphin, I see a dog, I see a baby, and I see a cat. So do these species go through internal or external fertilization based on what you know about these species? So we're not talking about development, just fertilization. Where is the egg gamete and the sperm gamete? Where do they meet? Inside the organism's body or on the outside of the organism's body? Well, the baby should have been a clue. Hopefully you know that this is all internal fertilization. So babies, cats, dogs, animals like dolphins, they all go through internal fertilization. Now, I know on the last slide I said a lot of fish go through external fertilization, but remember, dolphins are not fish. They are mammals. They're just underwater mammals. So there are some exceptions to life in the sea. They don't all go through external fertilization. Some of them, like dolphins, like whales, they are mammals, so they go through internal fertilization. Now, let's look at this page. Make one more guess. Do the species you see on the screen, a starfish, a frog, and a blowfish, do they use internal or external fertilization? So where does the sperm cell and the egg cell meet and go through that process of fertilization? The correct answer is externally. All of these species go through external fertilization. Now, I know earlier in this unit we talked about starfish producing asexually, but that is not the case for all starfish. We actually only know 3 species of starfish that reproduce asexually. All the rest go through sexual reproduction, specifically external fertilization and development. The starfish, just like the frogs, just like the blowfish, what they do is the starfish with the eggs, they release their gametes into the water, and then the starfish with the sperm gametes releases that gamete over the eggs. The two organisms don't even have to meet, even though we have two parents, yes, sexually contributing their genes to make one offspring. They don't even have to meet each other for that to happen because it all occurs externally. Now, one thing that you should know is that external fertilization mostly occurs with aquatic organisms and amphibians, so mostly with organisms that live underwater. Not always, but that is the majority, maybe 99% of organisms that go through external fertilization, they live in the water or they are half on land, half in the water. Now, if there's any questions about anything that we've gone over, internal or external fertilization or internal or external development, raise your hand. Either myself or one of the other adults in the room will come over and we can answer these questions as best you can. But hopefully you have a better understanding about some of the differences and some of the nuances with sexual reproduction. Here's your final job for today. Make sure that your notes are all in your notebook. Your notes are up to date. And then go ahead and start working on the exit ticket. It should say 1-5 exit ticket at the top. You're going to complete that whole thing, and then you're going to turn it into the turn-in bin once you are done. So that's it for this video. Go ahead and log off of the computer, put it back on the cart on the charger for the next class, and get to work on the exit ticket.